Hi, my name is Mark, and I'm a teaching pastor at Christ Church of the Valley in Phoenix, Arizona. And my topic is surrendering to King Jesus' mission. Now, normally you would expect to start in the Great Commission, go into all the world, make disciples, right? Now, I'm going to start before that, because that's our commission. But we're talking about Jesus' mission. And he announced that long before the Great Commission, going back to one of his earliest sermons in his own hometown synagogue of Nazareth. Jesus stood up, took the scroll from the chazan, which is the one leading the service, and he rolled it to his own choice of a passage. Now, normally they did scriptural reading, so there would be a passage assigned for the day. But when the rabbi began to give his homily, his sermon, the rabbi could choose his own passage. And we know that Jesus chose this passage rather than it being a liturgical reading, because if it's a reading given to you, you read every word verbatim. And Jesus doesn't do that. He actually conflates a couple of passages together. And before I read the passage, I just want to talk about why this is so important to Luke. Notice, Matthew and Mark both tell the same story, but they don't give near the details that Luke does. I find that significant. You see, Luke, as you well know, is the only Gentile contributor to the entire Bible, not just the New Testament. Why was this sermon so important to him? It's because of the way Jesus handled this text. It is predicting when the Messiah would come, that the Messiah would be not just for Israel, but for all people. Here's the way the passage reads out of Isaiah 61. I'm going to put it on the screen so you can follow along exactly what he read and what he didn't read. It says this: "The Spirit of the Lord is on me," Isaiah 61, verse 1a, "because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor," chapter 61, 1b. "He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind." Notice he skips section C of that verse and goes straight to D. In the Masoretic text, that is the Hebrew text, it says released from darkness of the prisoners. So this particular translation has made it more around miracles. And to release the oppressed. That's actually from Isaiah 58, chapter 6, section D. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Again, back to Isaiah 61, this is verse 2a. And he omits 61, 1c, binding up the brokenhearted, as well as 61, 2b, the day of the vengeance of our God. Now let's talk about that. He takes a snippet from chapter 58. He takes out something from chapter 61. Why? Specifically, what Jesus took out is the talk about judgment. Now, Jesus wasn't shy. He was the judge of the world. He's not being coy here. But now is not the time. During his incarnational ministry, Jesus did not wreak vengeance on his enemies. He didn't display this kind of aggressive messianic power. This passage, also quoted in Qumran, was interpreted quite differently. Qumran, like all the other Jewish literature of its day, when it talked about the Messiah, which was somewhat rare, there's only about 13 discussions about the Messiah in all of the 800 Qumran scrolls. So it's not a common conversation. But where the Jews had this conversation, in the Bible, in intertestamental literature, in rabbinic teaching, the Messiah was always a regal warrior, wreaking vengeance on his enemies. And when Jesus quotes this very passage, common to Qumran, he eliminates the very thing that was the center of most Jewish teaching on the subject of the Messiah. That's a powerful observation, because what we are left with is not a Messiah that punishes his enemies, but is punished for his enemies. Specifically revolving around this idea of the year of Jubilee. Notice Jesus says it's the acceptable year of the Lord's favor. Debts are released. Prisoners are freed. He's talking about a Jubilee practice ordained in the Old Testament that was never fully practiced in any strand of Judaism at any time, anywhere. Now, if you follow along in the notes that I provided, you can see several passages in Jewish literature that remember the year of Jubilee as if it's a good thing, as if it should have happened, but it was never practiced. And what Jesus is saying is, now is Jubilee. Not where the Messiah comes to destroy his enemies, but where the Messiah comes to suffer for his enemies and release those in debt, release those from prison. The stunned crowd is listening to Jesus. He rolls up the scroll, gives it back to the Chazan, and we don't have his whole sermon. I wish we did. We just have basically one sentence. Today, this passage is fulfilled in your hearing. Whew, you should have been there. The people who honored their hometown prophet are now dismayed. How dare you, the son of a carpenter? We know your pedigree. You ain't all that. How dare you say that this prediction of the Messiah is about you? And by the end of the message, you recall the passage, they're going to take him to a precipice of a hill and try to assassinate him by throwing him off. Why? It's not just because Jesus claimed this passage for himself, that he fulfilled the messianic promise, but it's how he did it. The people of the synagogue, Jesus cites two passages or two proverbs that were fairly common among the Jews. In fact, they're common in all kinds of literature, not just in Judaism. The first one is when the people say, "Physician, heal yourself. Do the miracles here you did elsewhere, and if you can prove yourself, we might believe that you're the Messiah." And Jesus responds with his own proverb, where he says, "No prophet is honored in his own hometown." And then he begins to explicate or explain that proverb by going to two Old Testament figures. One is Elijah, and one is Elisha. And he reminds them of how those two prophets were not welcome in Israel, but in fact did their greatest works outside of Israel. The passage reads as follows: "I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut up for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." And the response is, the people were furious. Because Jesus is not only saying, "I'm not the kind of Messiah that you think I am. Oh, I'm Messiah. Not the kind you hope for. Rather, I'm going to go outside of Israel. I'm not accepted in my own hometown. That's clear by your reaction. So I'm going to go elsewhere." Little did they know that where he was going to go was literally to the ends of the earth. By saying that his ministry, like Elisha and Elijah, was for others, not for them alone, it raised a whole new expectation of what the Messiah was going to be like. And I think if we don't get that, then we are going to misunderstand the Great Commission, which is merely a continuation of what Jesus wanted to start in Nazareth. Now, most churches that I am familiar with get this idea that the gospel is for Gentiles because, hey, we is one. And when we say to people, the gospel is not just for Jews, it's for all kinds of people, like, we understand that. But where a lot of churches I'm familiar with stop is with the ethnicity of Jubilee. But remember, Jubilee wasn't just a freedom for Jesus to include all kinds of other people. It was freedom of the high economically and low economically. For those who were legal and illegal. For those who were in prison and out of prison. For male and female. Now again, we get that as long as those other people are baptized like us. And one of the things that I think is going to mark discipleship in the future is our willingness to create churches for people for whom churches are uncomfortable. I'm going to circle back around to that. Let me just talk about two primary implications from this passage. Number one is the idea of Jubilee, which is social justice. That is part of discipleship, part of evangelism, is not just preaching the gospel, but taking care of the needs of people. Now, you might say, yeah, but we're concerned about people's spiritual needs, not their physical needs. Wow. Try to convince a mother of that you're concerned for her child's eternal state, but not their temporary state. I don't believe that we can truly love people the way God loves people if we're not concerned about the entire person. It's holistic evangelism. And what we know, this is not a guess, this is what we know, that churches that attend to the social, physical, spiritual, and emotional health of their communities, those inside the church as well as those outside the church, have a more powerful voice than those who do not. So here's implication number one. Authentic discipleship is centrifugal. It's not just for your people who are baptized, or people who dress up for church, or people who know the Bible, or people who pray. It is for all people inside and outside the church. If we're to preach the Jubilee of Jesus, it will be, if we're going to do discipleship in an authentic way, it will be attending to the whole person, not just the intellect of a person or the spirit of a person. The second implication is this, that social justice, therefore, is a part of teaching everything that Jesus commanded. Now, if we fast forward to the Great Commission, go into all the world, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them everything that I've commanded you. Part of the commands of Jesus include the treatment of other people. Love your enemies, for example. Take care of children. Being generous with widows and orphans in their distress. And what I've noticed is that, especially during this coronavirus, those churches that are centrifugal in nature, that they want to make a comfortable invitation to Jesus, not an easy one, but one that is recognizable and comes into other people's worlds, they are having more impact on their community than ever before. Second, those churches that have already attended to social needs are better postured during this crisis to survive. Now, let me be as clear as I know how. When we're talking about discipleship, most churches rally around the discipline of prayer and Bible study, which are inward focused. It's what God can do for me. But when you get to the disciplines of generosity, giving, which I think after prayer, after Bible study, that is the next lesson of discipleship in practical terms, leading someone on a path to live and act like Jesus. Those people who know generosity and those churches who have already practiced generosity to meet the needs of those in their community are better postured than ever before. Because now the community is reaching out to the church for support of social systems during a time of a pandemic. The second thing that I've observed is after you move from prayer and Bible study, which is inward focus, and it's foundational, we need to do that. Then you get to generosity. The next thing is the implementation of your spiritual gifts in the community. Discipleship is not learning more about the Bible. It is living out the Bible in a communal way that addresses the holistic needs of a community. And when we do that, we truly have power. If we are going to attend to discipleship with a kingdom mindset, it has to be to disciple people through the disciplines of prayer, Bible reading, and giving, to the implementation of their giftedness in the community. And ultimately, when we do that, we will earn the right to speak the truth of the gospel to outsiders. And that is when the person who has become a disciple makes a disciple. And until a disciple disciples, you have to question whether they are a fully mature disciple, adopting the mission of King Jesus.